Bretton Woods, baby. It's all about the gold standard. In 1944, there was a general agreement post-World War II that currencies and countries would agree to abide by the gold standard, i.e. if you had British pound or a US dollar or, name it, it was backed to something concrete, something that had an intrinsic, universally agreed value, gold. The gold standard. And this was how money worked for a good 30 years. From around 1940 through to 1971, the US, UK, Europe, most of the world and most of the world's currencies adhered to a backing against the gold standard. And then in 1971, the US said, no mas, no more. We are done with the gold standard. We are moving our dollar away from the gold standard. We have run out of gold to back the gold standard with. From now on, we are going to trade our currencies against each other. So if you want US dollars, fine. You can have them at whatever rate we agree to have them at. And so every currency became a floating point against each other. The value of one currency relative to another. The fiat system of currency was born, whereby currencies had no individual intrinsic value except for the value they held relative to each other. I hope this is making sense because what comes next is really interesting, and it's a story of how the US dollar achieved global dominance as the de facto reserve fiat currency of the world. Now, it didn't happen straight away. It happened after 1974, but the groundwork was underway in this nice little period between 1971 and 1974 when the world backed away from currencies pegged to gold. What the US did, they did something really clever. They looked at the global landscape and they realized what the world would need. And what the world would need at that point was what everyone needed. It was oil. Where was the oil? Well, most of the oil was in the Middle East at the time. The OPEC nations, or what are now known as the OPEC nations, they were the main producers of oil. But I'll tell you something. What were they selling oil in 1973? It wasn't US dollars, no. No, they weren't selling it in US dollars. And they weren't selling oil for gold. Nope. Guess again. It was the Indian rupee. The Indian rupee was the de facto reserve international currency of the Middle East until 1974. So what happened? Why did it change? Well, the US did something really interesting. They went up to Saudi Arabia and they went to a few other nations and said, look, we know you have considerable issues with stability here. We know there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict going on. We know the Russians are interested in your territory. They are eyeing Afghanistan. We know you guys are in a precarious position as far as the balance of global power goes. So hey, let's help you out. The Middle East guys, the Saudis, said, sure, we could use a bit of help. We need to be a bit more stable around here, and we need to assert our dominance and control of the area away from potential adversaries, of which there were many, because everyone wanted oil. And so the US said, fine, have our arms, because the US, relatively fresh off the Second World War, was an industrial powerhouse and a fairly strong economic magnate and a pretty good manufacturer of arms. So the US said, have our arms and sign an agreement with us that you guys will take our arms and you will form a military strategic alliance with us. In return, you will only sell oil in US dollars. Doesn't matter who you're selling it to, you will always sell it in US dollars. And you see, this was genius because it demonstrated that at the time, the US understood something which I think most developing nations and even the heads of many developed nations still don't understand, which is what the nature of liquidity is. The nature of liquidity is distribution, dependency, usage, and flow. And by making it so that all the world's oil at that time had to be bought and sold in US dollars, they were creating the global dominancy of demand on the US dollar as the primary trading asset, not just for oil, but by extension, all of the things that oil is required to make run, all of the things that are dependent on oil. The US single-handedly detached itself from the gold standard and in a 3-year period engineered a situation in which their fiat currency was the dominant fiat currency of the world. If you want to take out loans, if you want to do investment, ultimately all of it really has to be done through US dollars to some extent. The whole economy, by intrinsically tying the flow of oil to the flow of the US dollar, across the world, that whole global economy was now dependent to the US economy. Debt was beholden to the US predominantly because the US had achieved dominancy of liquidity with its fiat currency. It achieved dominance of use. And thus, until now, the US dollar has remained the predominant global reserve currency of the world. Yes, there are others, but the US still holds dominance to this day because of their foresight and their wisdom in negotiating agreements that were made in 1974. But this is also where the problem began, because as you may or may not know, any note of fiat currency is really a note of debt from a government to you. That means when you hold the note of your respective currency, that government that backs that currency, that note, they are in debt to you for whatever unit of value that note represents. Now, the US Federal Reserve from 1974 onwards continued to print and print and print more US dollars. The US government was driving itself deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And the consequence of this is that the intrinsic value of each US dollar over a period of time has steadily declined. This is inflation, the extent of which is so severe that a $1 note acquired 100 years ago in 1920 would be worth $13 today. That's 1,200% depreciation of value. Likewise, a single US dollar acquired in 2007 would be worth $1.26 today. That is a 26% depreciation of value within a 13-year period. That is huge. And what's interesting is that despite this ever-growing US debt pool, the US has still maintained its supremacy as the fiat reserve currency of the world. But it's done this through having an outward perspective, through negotiating alliances with other countries, through playing a role in international politics, through using its military might, strategic vision, and creative engineering to help augment and enforce international treaties and alliances, to be a safeguard, a backer, an enforcer. Because the rest of the world looked at this growing debt burden and thought, yes, it's true. The US is going to struggle to pay this back. But what they are giving us in return is military backing. They're giving us international oversight and leadership. And this is the price of being reliant on the US dollar as your reserve currency. The rest of the world has had to work on the assumption that the US would, despite its own internal conflicts, be a guarantor to the world's interests. For many years now, it has been on the international stage with an international reputation for being involved strongly in international affairs and culture. But the problem is, the US has been gradually withdrawing from that commitment in one way or another, and the perception of the US as a guarantor to these contracts has depreciated. The belief that the US can be perceived to be a reliable guarantor or safeguard of democracy and human rights has come into question through recent local events. I don't need to sit and name them. The last 4 years, and if we take the 07-08 financial crisis as a true starting point, which for me it is, the last 13 years have really shown us that the US is not the guarantor that we thought it was. And this creates a problem because it creates a problem of perception. When the perception of being a guarantor is not there, then your ability to enforce your status as a de facto reserve currency begins to weaken, because you're no longer able to back your debt with anything. You can't back your debt by printing more debt. You can only back your debt with objective actions that are acceptable as a form of repayment to your lender. And if the US is perceived to be refraining from any objective action to back the debt that it's accumulated, then its currency can no longer be seen to be stable. It can be seen to be volatile, and a need may arise to move away from that currency towards something else. And I believe that's beginning to happen, and I believe people are beginning to wake up and realize this. People are turning to Bitcoin. I'm starting to see the headlines in the mainstream press. People are starting to think of Bitcoin as a potential global reserve currency more seriously now than they did a few years ago. I think we will see a shift towards Bitcoin, and I believe that will undermine the idea of the USD as the global reserve currency. And I think, ironically, we are returning closer and closer to a gold standard, be it a digital gold standard in the form of Bitcoin. Whether you agree with that or not is one thing. Whether you think that's a good idea or not is another thing. But I do feel that the impetus and the recognition of change is there. But before I go, I ask you to consider this. When we look for the source of wealth, we should always ask ourselves where the self-interest lies. In the case of US currency dominance, self-interest lay in US interests. But with Bitcoin, where does the self-interest lie? Because behind currency ultimately lies the backing of people. It is the people that make a currency, and I ask you to consider, who are the people that are backing Bitcoin? Consider carefully in its history that its early liquidity came as a result of the Silk Road, darknet markets. That drew in independent financial speculators, who in turn drew institutional investors. The Chinese became heavily involved early. In fact, they are so entrenched that they provide 65% of global hash rate to the Bitcoin network as of recording. Much of Bitcoin's growth and liquidity has derived from Southeast Asian countries. So if you're looking for where the shift of power lies, I suggest you look there. And if you're looking at the shift of geopolitics, I ask you to consider the values of these societies, because ultimately these are the values that will come to predominate the mindset of whoever uses that predominant wealth. Think carefully.